And now it is my true pleasure to introduce the first panel from this morning. Claire Perry O'Neill, will you join me here on the stage? Oh, there you are. Claire, so happy to introduce you here and give the word to you in a few moments. You have been a true long-standing supporter as a business fellow at the Oxford Smith School, and you are the co-chair of Global Imperatives Advisory Board at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and you are a former Minister for Energy and Clean Growth in this very country.
Thank you, Mette.
You're also an alumni from
Yes,
Oxford, indeed. So I could not have a better, panel moderator here for this panel called The Global Vision, Cultivating a Prosperous Future Within the Earth's Boundaries. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm actually going to invite my panelists up here because everyone knows what I think. So it's much more interesting actually to discuss with our panelists. So we've got, who is coming up first? Emily McKenzie, who is one of the absolute drivers of the TNFD. Grab a seat anywhere, Emily. We'll do full introductions. Howard Covington, please come up and join us. And then Rita de Mesquita, who's flown in from Brazil, especially for this event. Thank you so much. So incredibly important. Everyone comfortable? Yeah, super. Thank you so much. So we have about 45 minutes, I think I'm right in saying, to try and unpick this topic of cultivating a prosperous future within Earth boundaries. And I went from politics in 2020 for a number of reasons to join an institution called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which very much frames this idea of imperatives. The imperative being, how do we get the Earth's population forecast to be 9 billion people by 2050 to live well within planetary boundaries? And at WBCSD, we talk a lot about three imperatives: the imperative of climate change, the imperative of biodiversity loss, and the imperative of growing inequality around the world. And climate change, I think of S-curves for this. We start with a sort of a pile of information that we need to organise. We then start to create action, and hopefully we get up to the point where we achieve rapid success. Climate, we're coming up, I think, that curve. I don't know how many other people stayed up to celebrate the closing of the last coal plant in Radcliffe-on-Stour yesterday. It was a meaningful moment for me, having pushed very hard to phase out coal and started the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And it shows that we can transition away from the world's most polluting fossil fuels with the right policy, the right incentives, and an array of alternatives that enable us to run a balanced grid. Nature, Emily and I were debating where we are on the S-curve, but I think it's fair to say that with Emily's work, and Emily is the technical director at TNFD, before that worked in the Treasury on the Dasgupta Review, which I think was absolutely game-changing for helping us understand the value of nature in the UK, and then has a history at the WWF. She and I were debating where we were on the S-curve, and she's going to talk to us a bit about what TNFD was doing. Rita de Mesquita, which is a wonderful name. I realised it rhymes, Rita. Yes. Now I read it out. Rita is a lifelong biological expert, particularly in the Amazon. She described herself as emerging from the Amazon to take on this hugely important role, Secretary of Biodiversity, Forest and Animal Rights in Brazil. Fascinating, given that COP30 is coming to Brazil, the re-energizing of the Nature COP, I think, at Cali this year, to hear from you. And then finally, last but not least, Howard Covington. Howard is a highly successful financier, turned philanthropist, and does a number of things, including being on the Smith School Advisory Panel and chairing Client Earth. And when we met at dinner last night, I said, Howard, you actually sued me. How you sued me as the most ambitious minister the UK has ever had? This is outrageous. Although he doesn't sue me, he sues lots of directors by name. There's a reason I'm not a director in the UK, actually. But Howard has a fascinating set of perspectives, particularly on the shifts required in the food system, which of course is responsible for so much biodiversity loss. So let's plunge in with a series of questions. And do feel free, by the way, we'll get to each of you individually, but then let's feel free to build on this. Rita, if I can start with you, I think because Brazil is so much in the news and the spotlight, tell us a bit about this interaction between climate and nature or biodiversity, because I think we all see some of the risks, but also the opportunities there. But help us understand that.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank the invitation, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And it's also a little intimidating.
Oh, no. You're amongst friends, Rita.
This is my first time in Oxford, so of course, as a scholar, I have always heard of Oxford highly, and to hear about this new move to integrate different sciences, I think is such a smart and necessary move for education. And I say that trying to answer your question, Claire, because the only reason why we clearly understood the role of the Amazon for the world and for us Brazilians was because we crossed the disciplinary boundaries some 20 years ago with an enormous effort, one of the largest efforts in the world, to really tackle what the Amazon was all about from the different disciplinary perspectives. And by bringing together climatologists, physical chemistry, hydrologists, biologists together, we actually were able to understand the Amazon so much better than any one of the fields individually were able to do it. And this is the reason why I can answer with a lot of confidence that the climate and biodiversity crossroads, I mean, the solution to all those so critical crises are by merging what we've been discussing as independent solutions. And I really think that if we don't cross that bridge, if we don't make that movement fast, we will continue discussing these issues independently, and this is not going to bring us to the necessary solutions. For Brazil, I can say that from the models that we've run, from the estimates and commitments that we are discussing and trying to make happen, about 80% of the climate crisis solution for us will come from nature-based solutions. So there is no other way. I mean, if we don't come up with very clever, smart ways of dealing with the climate problem in Brazil, we're not going to solve that problem. And I think it's very important to say the dimension of what that means, because Brazil is a country, but the size of a continent. Biodiversity is the most biodiverse country in the world. So nothing there is simple. Everything there is extremely complex. Everybody, when you say Brazil, everybody thinks about the Amazon. But Brazil has 6 biomes plus all the coast, which is one of the largest in the world. So we need to go beyond. Of course, the Amazon is 2/3 of Brazil. But when you look at the diversity that we have there, the solutions will also have to be diverse. And they will have to be regional, and they will have to be locally negotiated. And I think this is one of the critical things for this subject, is that we think global, and we think that we're going to come up with global solutions. But looking what we have, the reality of my country, I would say we're going to have to think a lot local and come up with regional solutions. And it's the combination of all this that will then emerge. I did my PhD at the University of Georgia in the United States with Eugene Oldham. I mean, he was not my major professor, but he was there at the time. And he said, like, an ecosystem is bigger than the sum of its parts. Well, I would say for the climate crisis and what we're trying to accomplish here, the solution will be more than the combination of all the parts that each one of us can perform in our, in our realms, in our business, in our parts of the world. But we just have this world. So we can only hope that by the time we've addressed everything that each one of us can do, we will be able to emerge something that is bigger than the individual solutions that each one of us could come up with.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing out the diversity of problems and solutions that are there. So you're right, you say we think about Brazil, we think about the Amazon, there are so many other ecosystems. Emily, your TNFD arguably built on the success of TCFD, but trying to avoid some of the mistakes, if you like, or not mistakes, but things that perhaps slowed the rollout. And in particular, you did focus on a diversity of actors when you were pulling together that guidance, and also tried to give people guidelines that meant individual solutions could be put within metrics. Tell us a bit about how that's going, because I'm sure, I know people will know about TNFD as a concept, but give us a few specifics, because I think it's a really amazing piece of work.
Thanks, Claire, and also thanks for the invitation to be here. I was born in Oxford, so I feel like I'm coming back to my roots, and in fact, my niece is going to start, I guess this week, whenever you begin, here at St Hilda's.
Oh,
so being here today is like coming back to both my past and my future, and I've also been, through the work with TNFD and before, very inspired and learned a lot from the work of the Smith School, especially the work on spatial assets and so on. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So what TNFD has done is built from the Climate Disclosure Initiative that was set up by Mike Bloomberg and Mark Carney back in 2016. And as you said, learnt from that. They blazed a trail, pioneering a focus on disclosure as a way to create accountability and transparency and thereby shift finance. But we are framed around nature more broadly, acknowledging that climate change is one of the Earth systems that's outside of its safe space. But unfortunately, as Howard and I were just discussing, the evidence is we're outside of the safe space of 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And so we have built by design with the Taskforce on the 11 recommendations of the TCFD, which actually all make sense around governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets to expand to nature. I mean, they take some thought. Governance is quite self-explanatory, but things around scenario analysis take some thought. But then also added 3 further recommendations, which actually really resonate with what Rita was saying. The first is really this critical question of where, so location, because so much for nature matters in a particular place. So we recommend that organizations, so corporates and financial institutions, disclose where they have what we call material nature-related issues, so significant impacts or significant risks, and also where they're in sensitive locations, areas of very high biodiversity like the Amazon. So that where question, and also then their engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities who will also be affected by nature and by a corporate or a financial institution's investment in a particular activity. And finally, a recommendation recognizing the importance of value chains, because so much with nature will happen upstream through suppliers, which may be smallholder farmers, for example, or downstream through pollution, chemical pollution and so on. And so understanding the traceability is really important. And then we also went further than TCFD in producing quite a wealth of guidance. So when we first began, there was a sense that nature was new and it was complex. Well, I think as we've done pilot testing with 240 organizations, they've learned actually it's not that new. They'd already been dealing with circularity, with sustainability in a range of relevant ways. So we've created guidance on how to identify and assess your issues, and then on technical topics like best practice with engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, drawing on things like the UN guiding principles. And so moving as well, crossing not only the connections with nature, synergies and trade-offs with nature, but also starting to move into that connection with society. And then you alluded to this a bit, Claire, in the process. So I think what we've done in TNFD has been very bottom-up. We had an extremely collaborative process over 2 years. We used the analogy of software development, so we produced beta releases, which really it's a framework, so it's quite different from a software beta. But they were first drafts. We were willing to put out something that was good enough for feedback, incorporate feedback from around the world. We had thousands of pieces of feedback to produce what we did, and that has really helped us accelerate action through voluntary adoption. So we now have 420 voluntary adopters of the TNFD, because people had built that learning and that understanding through a very collaborative co-creation process. So I think that we learned a lot through the process as well as from the substance that has built from TCFD. We're very grateful and remained in very close contact from them all the way through, but also pioneered some new ways of thinking.
And in a moment, I'd like you to give us some examples of where it's working, but I did want to bring in Howard. Howard, you were not at Oxford, were you? The other place. Another place, where my husband is a professor, but we won't talk about that. But you have, I think, a fascinating perspective, both on the issue of hitting multiple planetary boundaries at once, but also some fairly radical solutions. And I know you may want to talk about other things apart from the solution for food, but I think you have perhaps the most advanced thinking I've come across in how rapidly we could transition the food system. So talk to us about boundaries and potentially food.
It's very kind of you to say so. And it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm only capable of taking quite a simple perspective on the world. So I think of things in terms of critical pairs. So we have climate change, and that is paired with the energy transition. And the critical variable right now in that pair is how fast wind and solar are developing and how fast the demand for energy, the global demand for energy is developing, and the difference between the two rates of growth will determine substantially how much the world warms. We know where we are with climate change and the energy transition. We know roughly what the problems are. But now we can move on to the nature transition and its pair, which I think is the food transition. So we have started a mass extinction, and the mass extinction will go up some sort of growth curve. The thing that has enabled climate change to be taken on by the energy transition is the amazingly fast pace at which solar and wind have reduced in price and gone up their penetration curves. What is the corresponding phenomenon with the destruction of nature? Well, my suspicion is it's the speed with which the price of alternative proteins come down their cost curve, and correspondingly go up a penetration curve. The interesting fact about alternative proteins is that the price of making cultured meat has come down at something like 45% a year for the last 10 years. It's gone from $300,000 for a hamburger to $12 for a kilogram of chicken. And the question, I think, before us is, can we take the demand for continually imposing on nature, can we reduce that demand by reducing the demand for farmed meat and other farmed food, by ramping up rapidly the production and sale of alternative proteins? Now, that's an interesting question. I mean, the Smith School was already producing papers on that. There's a lot of work to do, just as there's a lot of work on the energy transition, there's a lot of work to do in getting alternative proteins up their penetration curve. But I also look at those two transitions, energy and nature, against the third transition, which is the world population has grown exponentially. Its fertility is now decreasing around the world, with one or two possible notable exceptions. We've been creating a background of chemicals which by the second half of the century will increase the rate at which fertility falls. So we may well get a bell-shaped curve of human population. And the interesting thing about that is, if we can get ourselves through this rather critical period of the next 60 or 70 years, the pressure on the Earth's systems might well decrease of its own accord. So we are faced with quite an interesting
three generational problem.
It's I suspect it's a three-generational problem, and it can be solved.
This is a really interesting hypothesis, because it does. So we're hitting max crunch, if you like, now, and in a way it may solve itself, but it will solve itself in a disorderly and painful fashion, with impacts being felt worst but amongst those who can least afford it. Can I ask a supplementary question, Howard? And this is with my policy hat on, that the reason we managed to make rapid gains, for example, in the UK energy system with gas plus renewables replacing coal, is there were relatively few actors in the mix. There was a policy, you had relatively few companies. Energy is sort of somewhat easy. I always think of food and nature as being much more difficult because you have billions of subsistence level farmers, often women, who are not in receipt of information and education. I know we have some giant corporations at the pinnacle of the food supply chain, but how easy is it to affect change? Is this a difficult system to change, given the proliferation of actors in it?
Well, one of the main drivers of change in the energy system has been China and the rate at which it's developed the technology. It's very interesting that one of the main actors now in what I think will be a food transition is also China. They're developing alternative proteins. They're investing in alternative proteins very quickly. If the world knows anything, if the Western world knows anything, it is that if it falls behind China's ability to develop technologies, there are going to be problems down the line. So if we are sensible in the West, we will see what's coming, we'll develop the technologies, and we'll allow a protein transition, a food transition, simply because the technology will carry us along as solar and wind have carried us along in the energy transition.
So it might be happening in small levels, but happening at scale. And actually, can we take that lens, Rita, and talk a bit about the populations of the regions for which you are responsible? Because there is always this big conversation, isn't there, about how do we get change happening from the bottom up, particularly in indigenous communities, and how do we get funds flowing to affect that change? Tell us how that's going in Brazil and what we could do better.
Well, if I can share with you a little bit of a perspective, my perspective on this. First of all, it really worries me that every time that we think the problems that we're facing with will be solved by technology. And I have to say that because give us a sense of relief, but at the same time, at what cost? And then when you ask me the changes in the low-income populations, I would reverse the question. I would say, what are the changes that we are willing to make on our ways of living, on our standards of living? Because they're not the ones that have to change, we are. And I don't say that from like a political perspective or any of that. It's just that we have a lot to learn on sustainability. And also, when we talk about nature-based solutions, we're talking about cultural changes in human populations. We're talking about changing our diets. We're talking about changing our perception of value and our perception of well-being. So I think these are critical changes. These are cultural changes that we need to be discussing when we're talking about nature-based solutions, because we're looking into nature to give us the answer so that we can go on doing what we've been doing. But nature is telling us otherwise. It's telling us we have to change that. I mean, we can go on with these levels, with these standards. So it worries me that we always pose the question like that. Like every time we come up with a new concept, we create a concept that is really complex, that most people use the concept not meaning the same things. And we have a really hard time explaining the new concept to the local communities, to the low-income populations and all that. But they are the ones driving the solutions that we're looking for. I think it would be very good if we could adapt and adopt their concepts of value and also of limits. And we're not good at that. I don't think we are.
How much time does your department spend listening to having the dialogue, trying to change their behaviour of the millions of people that call these biodiverse areas home?
I don't spend time trying to change the behaviors. We spend time trying to listen. And trying to include.
Right.
Because this, I think, is a very critical thing. So I spend a lot of time trying to accommodate their perspectives on our design. So like right now, we just reaching the point of finishing up the country discussions for the National Biodiversity Strategy, the NBSAP for Brazil, right? We're not going to present it in COP16 for one reason.
Okay.
And the reason is because I'm really, really set on the idea that we need to communicate this strategy to everyone. If we're not able to communicate, if they're not able to understand, engage, and assume the commitments that we are making there as a country, then what is the use?
So you need to communicate it, have the buy-in in the country before you lay it down.
Of course.
Which is, by the way, almost never done. Countries cough out NDCs the whole time, and nobody has any idea how they've actually been created. So this is a change in strategy.
And also, I think we need to put this strategy at the core of the government. So this has to move from being a Ministry of the Environment strategy to become a country strategy for the Ministry of Transportation, for the Ministry of Industry, for the Ministry of Industry, because they have also a saying and a doing in that strategy. And if we don't do that, so it's not only communicating to other levels of government and trying to build some kind of understanding with them, but also to general society. And one of the critical things is for a country to establish a national strategy that recognizes the contribution of its own local communities and traditional folks. And this is something that we really trying to do very hard. I think we've gone quite a ways already in doing that. And it has to be more than just out of inclusion and respect. Is the recognition that they have workable solutions that will work for us all.
Really interesting. So when we throw around the phrase "putting a price on nature," it's actually trying to value all of the contributions in that value chain. Emily, I know you had this very bottom-up and inclusive approach in creating the framework, but you are ultimately reliant on companies to collect and report their data. And presumably the best companies are going out and trying to get this granular level of data when they're building up their TNFD reporting. Can you give us some examples of who does this really well? And perhaps tell us what good looks like, and then if you want to name names, tell us who does it well.
If I may, I'll also briefly respond afterwards to some of the comments earlier.
No, please respond first. I like a bit of dialogue.
So I really agree with Howard that the food system is the biggest priority as a sector for transformation. The data is clear, that's the highest priority sector. But I maybe wouldn't go for the simplicity of the pair. I think also this is relevant to all sectors. And one of the things that has been clear with TNFD, if you look at the 420 organizations that are adopting TNFD, they come from 80% of the sectors which are in the sector classification system. So pharmaceuticals, biotech, metals and mining. We're now starting to look at water utilities and marine infrastructure. So, I mean, everything is dependent and has impacts on nature. And so we're looking across sectors. And I'm really excited about one of the next pieces of work that the TNFD is blazing. And I have to recognize Abid, who is sitting in the room as one of our task force members from Bank of America, who's leading this working group. And we're looking at nature transition plans. And that's building from the best practices for how you do net zero transition planning that were pioneered by GFANZ, and then how you disclose them, which has been pioneered, I'm proud to say, here in the UK by the Transition Plan Taskforce, and thinking about that for nature. And so I think that will be a new focus, and it will shift us to thinking about action, not only disclosure, but then the transition across sectors for the food system and for others. And one of the things that worries me, though, that's missing is the equivalent of sector transition pathways, which, given there was 1.5 degrees and one metric, was easier to set out for climate, but is what financial institutions are now looking for when they think about their investees or banks for their lending. What does good, bad, and the transition from bad to good look like?
And on that, what is good? What is the less than 2 degrees equivalent?
Yes, and that's something also that's a frontier for us. But the Global Biodiversity Framework sets halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030 with the vision of for 2050. And so that, I think, is our gold star. But what we now wrestle to determine is for the MBSAPs, the national and local goals, and then for business and finance, what their contributions, how should they respond and contribute to that transition. So that's a really important frontier, and also something you said, Rita, I wanted to, the role of technology. So just with the Dasgupta review hat on, I really agree. One of the hard truths I think Partha told in that review is, of course, technology can play a role, but when we think about nature rather than climate, we're not necessarily in a world of win-wins. There are going to be some hard choices and some trade-offs, and talking about some of the things, Howard, you mentioned around population, which is often seen as something not to be spoken about, but we showed clearly that we need to increase the efficiency of how we operate with nature, reduce our consumption and production, think about the population growth, and that the next 70 years are critical, just as the last 70 years, the Partha would say in his lifetime, were so harmful. The next 70 years will be critical for that turnaround. But to come to your actual question, on data. So one of the things we heard 3 years ago when we started with the TNFD was this, I think we all agreed in TNFD, a myth. The data isn't out there. We can't move because there's no data. And we quickly busted that myth. There's tons of data. We did a landscape assessment. We've brought together data providers. We have nearly 150 of them pioneering this. But what we have uncovered is issues around data access. So that's both the input data, so things around the state of nature and the health of nature. But then, of course, as TNFD it's growing rapidly, but emerging, financial institutions don't have the same disclosure to be able to look at what the reports are of how companies are interacting with nature. So we have issues around that. And then one of the things the Smith School has been really interesting in its work on is around the location of companies' assets and activities. What are the types of that? So it's just remarkable how little we know about the location of where assets are and the types of production. So those are things that we in TNFD are continuing to look at, a blueprint potentially for a public data facility, very exploratory, but thinking about something like a value chain passport, which would be very relevant for SMEs in places like Brazil, wanting to reduce the cost of reporting, but knowing many of the impacts might be in local small enterprises. So that frontier with data, there's plenty out there. Already we're seeing assessments and disclosures, decision useful insights, but there are still some challenges that we think...
And what's fascinating again is that you are taking some of the lessons, I think, of the rollout of climate disclosure, quality assurance, which has become quite a fragmented universe and arguably not as helpful as it might be to companies who are, and particularly some of the financial companies leaning in. This is very good that you're trying to problem solve these things up front and bringing this whole community with you. We've got about a couple more minutes. I want to ask each of you, we've got COP16 coming up, followed by COP29 and then COP30. COP29, let's not write it off. I mean, I know the Azerbaijanis get stick, but they were the only country that volunteered to do it, I think, apart from Bulgaria, so we are where we are. But COP30, of course, coming to Brazil is a big moment. So I'd love to hear your views on what would be what would be very important for announcements there. But Howard, I'm fascinated by your food systems thing. I'm going to wave a magic wand. I'm going to make you Prime Minister for a day. You are our new Keir Starmer, or maybe our new Boris Johnson, or perhaps even better.
My suit isn't good enough.
I bet those glasses didn't cost £1,000. They might have done. But how would you... Let's say we wanted to major on this food transition and we wanted to bring the whole of the UK to try and deliver a change. Could we do it? Could we actually come up with a policy without suing everybody, which is, I know, one effective tactic?
We'll do that later, yeah.
What could we do to get something that is so important actually moving?
Okay, so just to pick up an earlier point, what is the equivalent of 2 degrees for the nature transition? And it's something like 50% of land surface and oceans set aside for nature. I mean, it's a goal of that magnitude. How do you get to that? And I'm going to come around to your question, is in my view, you take the pressure off nature. And how do you do it quickly? Well, if you look at the penetration curve of the Big Mac, I mean, it went from nobody eating Big Macs to everybody eating Big Macs in, I don't know, 20 years or something, and did this enormous amount of damage as forests were destroyed to raise cattle to make Big Macs. Okay, suppose you get very, very tasty cultured meat and have a cultured Big Mac, which then goes up its penetration curve very quickly and then takes the pressure off nature. I think encouraging the development of these kind of products and then having wise politicians face down the farming lobby in every country to make room for these products, which of course will severely erode farming, would be a great step forward. So I would like to see Keir Starmer in his wonderful suit eating a Big Mac made of cultured beef.
Shades of John Gummer. So he's not getting his children up to eat.
Oh, he can get his children as well. They'll enjoy it.
Very good, very good. You facing down the farming lobby, as you know, is painful and bloody, even though we have such an unreliance on domestic farming in the UK, but thank you. Okay, quick fire round to finish on time. Hopes and wishes for COP16 and the next two COPs. Emily?
I'm hoping for another big increase in adopter numbers of TNFD. I'm hoping for momentum around, with a coalition around addressing the data challenges I mentioned. And I'm hoping for excitement and a few corporates and financial institutions getting into nature in transition planning, either from a nature frame or nature for net zero, so that we can learn about that as a frontier.
Brilliant. Howard?
Oh, I want to see the amount set aside for nature increasing. So I want the plan to see it ramping up. 30% by 2030 is a great start, but it's not adequate. Let's get up to 50% as quickly as we can.
And Isabel, we're all coming to see you on the next couple of meetings. What would you like to see?
Well, I totally, align with Howard.
Sorry, Isabel, Rita.
Rita.
I'm thinking of Isabel Teixeira, another amazing Brazilian woman who I sometimes share a stage with. Rita, forgive
That's okay. But for sure, 30 is not enough. We have to have more. But what I really would like to see is, right now, there's a lot of money going into the climate issues, and not so much for the biodiversity. And what I would like to see is that people come up with, realize that a really good investment for climate is to protect the diverse forests, and so that we can bridge this through the investments to valuing standing forests, to valuing the complex ecosystems that we have, because we get this feeling that we could rebuild through restoration, but we're doing a very poor job at it when you think about the diversity that we have there. So if we can diverse some of this money to get the true value of protecting and maintaining the complex ecosystems that we have, I think we will have reached success for both COPs, for the biodiversity and for the climate COP. And that's what I would like to see.
Wonderful. Couldn't do it better myself. Thank you so much, Rita, Emily, Howard. Thank you so much for joining us.